Well, I know they were here. He was working on this.
Let's go on and get started tonight. We're in our 5th class on the study of the book of Job, and tonight the focus is going to be, we're going to be looking at the prologue, which really is chapters 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Job, as we kind of start delving a little bit into the text tonight. And as the text begins to open, we're first introduced to this figure, this man named Job, whose name appears on this book. And the very first thing that we're exposed to is the character of Job. And what we need to understand right at the onset, that Job in some senses is not any ordinary man. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying he's not flesh and blood, he doesn't leap tall buildings, but at least from God's perspective, he's not like everybody else. Twice when God speaks about Job, in Job chapter 1 and verse 8, there is no one like him on the earth. In chapter 2, and when God speaks to Satan again, he again says, there's no one like him. And so as we begin this study tonight and we begin to think about the character of Job, the first question I want to put out for everyone, how's Job's character described? How is he described? What about his character is pinpointed in the text? Blameless and upright. Fearing God, it says, and turning away from evil. So really, blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. So the question is what does that even mean? So what does it mean that Job was blameless? How can a man be described as without blame or blameless? So what does that say about him?
He's got a penitent heart.
Okay, a penitent heart.
All that is not sin.
Okay.
So what he does is good.
So Brian points out, and I think it's a key idea, that blameless doesn't mean he is sinless. But when he does sin, he accounts for it. He makes restitution if the case may require. It talks about being a sense of integrity and honesty about that. Some people look at this word blameless and they talk about the idea of sin being vertical in the sense of we have wronged God, while blamelessness is more of on a horizontal level. It's talking about any wrong that he might have committed against others. He is taking care of that. But what about upright? What does it mean that he's upright? I mean, so he's blameless and he's upright. Honest. Okay. Thinks about maybe the idea of he walks in the way of the Lord. He has a sense about him about fearing the Lord. Those other two qualities, I think, really kind of emphasize what this idea of uprightness looks like. He fears God and he always turns away from evil. So that's how Job's character is described here in really the very first verse of the book. But there's another insight into the character of this man that maybe not as obvious here in these first two chapters. Do you know what God calls Job? Look in verse 8 again of chapter 1. He said, "The Lord said unto Satan, have you considered my servant Job?" Look again in chapter 2 and verse 3. He says the exact same thing. For God to call someone his servant, at least from the Old Testament perspective, that is a pretty significant designation. The fact of the matter is as I kind of flipped through looking, I really only found 3 men that it's really highlighted that God considered his servants. You look at Moses in Exodus chapter 14, David, 2 Samuel 7, and then the prophet Isaiah. Now, there were other men who were God's servants, I'm sure, but those are the only ones that I know of that I can find that designation is specifically used to describe their relationship with God. Wayne?
What about Enoch?
Well, he walked with God, but he's not described as my servant. Again, I'm not saying there's not other men who were counted as servants. I'm just saying that term is used for them. And so right away, just looking at this, the character of this individual, not even apart from the statement that God makes that there's no one like him on the earth, you can see that this man stands out from the crowd. So he was blameless and he was upright. But that maybe raises a question for me. What evidence do we have in the book that reflects an accurate assessment of his character? I mean, God said it, that's enough. But what evidence do we have in the text that suggests that's the correct understanding of his character? Okay. Well, Larry points out the response to all the problems, especially the problems in chapters 1 and 2. It ends with all this, he did not sin with his lips. Yeah. What else? Anything else in the text stand out to you?
First thing he did when he got up was operate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know which, if you're looking at, you're thinking in verse 20 of chapter 1 or verse 5. Okay, yeah. When he rose up early. That's a great point. Also, when he rose up from or after the trials, the first thing he did was worship God. So I want you to see in this text, there's hints that slowly reveal his character. This assessment is completely accurate. And hey, Brian, would you care to switch the slide deck back to the original? Thanks. So let's look at verse 5 real quickly. I think there's a couple of things in verse 5 that kind of point to this. Verse 5 says, when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. I think there's a couple of things here in that one verse that point to his character. First of all, as Andy pointed out, he rises up early. He seems to make that a priority in his day. The first thing he thinks about is his relationship with God and his children's relationship with God. But secondly, he was concerned about the well-being of his children. It said there that he would offer burnt offerings to consecrate them. And did you notice that last phrase there in the very last word of verse 5? He did that continually. That's a diligence, an earnestness, a persevering type of attitude that's reflected by Job. And as Larry points out, how he responded to these trials. But later on in the text, we're even given some more insight into how Job spent his money, his time, and give us an assessment of his character. Job 29, look at verses 12 through 17. Listen to what he did. I mean, this is from Job as he looked over his life in the past. He says, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper, the blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me. I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth. So as Job reflected on his past life, we get a little insight into the character. He was concerned about those who were less fortunate than him, those who had need for someone to come and act as a redeemer in some sense. He cared for the poor, the orphan, those who were ready to perish. They would come to him for a blessing. He would make the widow's heart to sing. Look over chapter 31. Again, another reference kind of in verse 16. Kind of a similar situation. But again, it gives us description of this man. He says, if I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone and the orphan has not shared it, but from my youth he grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, if he had not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulders fall from the socket and my arm be broken off at the elbow, for calamity from God is terror to me, and because of his majesty I can do nothing. Now think about this. So obviously Job is looking at his life and how he has acted, and in somewhat of a defensive mechanism, kind of justifying himself. And maybe this is somewhat exaggerated as we look at the past, but he's saying, if I have failed in any one of these, let this harm befall me. And again, it focuses on how he took care of the poor and the widows, how he would share, how he would raise those who were orphans. This man's character was amazing to think about. And no wonder God would say, there's no one like him on all the earth. In addition to that, you almost get the incredulity of his friends, right? When his friends eventually come to give him comfort, you almost see the shock and amazement because they can't in their minds fathom how such a good man could be suffering like this. Again, a testament to his character. And in many ways, and this kind of connects some of the wisdom literature together, Job really exemplifies what the wise man looks like in the book of Proverbs. I mean, much of what Proverbs has to say about wisdom and the person that walks after God is really found in this person who is Job. And that shouldn't be surprising, right? Anyone who walks in wisdom will have those characteristics. Just look at two verses. In Proverbs chapter 2, verse 7 and verse 21, just to kind of make this point. Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 7, it says, he stores up wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity. Verse 21, for the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. Talking about God's perspective on them, but notice those two words, blameless and upright. Again and again, we see this in Job's life. So he's like nobody else. But really the focus of chapters 1 and 2 set up this contrast. I mean, you've got this good, godly man, and he undergoes trials. Pretty severe trial. I mean, I can't imagine a more useful servant for the Lord or someone who's doing as much as he was at that time. But yet, we see him in chapter 2 facing trial. And what we see is really God permitting Satan to inflict upon Job two sets of trials. And I kind of put those in, highlighted those, if you will, just in quotation marks, because it's really not two sets of trials. We see a set of trials in chapter 1, a trial in chapter 2, but really the whole book of Job is the trial of humanity. And what I mean by that, so think about how the trials unfold in chapters 1 and 2. Job is successful in overcoming those because he doesn't sin with his lips. But you know who doesn't? His wife. And she becomes a trial for him. His 3 friends who meant to come and comfort him become a trial for him. So his trials persist all the way through the book. But in chapters 1 and 2, they kind of fall into 2 sets. And the first is they take what he has, and that's his possessions and his children. And in chapter 2, it's how it afflicts his person or his body. Now, and what we begin to see in chapters 1 and 2 is this interplay between heaven and earth, where Satan accuses Job in heaven and then attacks him on earth. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time at this point on that kind of interplay, but let me just ask you this question. That scene in heaven when Satan comes in the presence of God along with the other sons of God, who speaks first about Job? In each occasion, God does. God holds Job up as an example to Satan. In some ways, have you ever, as a proud parent or grandparent, like brought out your phone and showed somebody your picture? Look at my cute child. Look what they're doing now. Look what they've achieved. It's almost that sense. Look, there is one of my creatures who is blameless and upright. He's like no one else. He is seriously committed to me. He holds up Job. God speaks first. And what I want us to just kind of note just quickly is this kind of reinforces, as this scene plays out, a truth we know from the New Testament. And it's the truth kind of spoken of in James chapter 1. In James chapter 1, there's a statement made about God that we need to just recognize. It says, "Let no one say when he is tempted that I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil. He himself does not tempt anyone." And what we see played out in chapter 1 is that very idea. God permits it. But Satan is the one who does the affliction. It is Satan. And both of them, through these 2 experiences, have 2 drastically different outcomes or desired outcomes in mind. So, let's look at the trials for just a little bit. Anybody got anything to say, or questions or ideas before we jump into the trials themselves just a little bit? Okay. So his first set of trials. I want us to see that it begins with really the introduction in verse 13 of Job, where we have this statement made. It says, "Now on the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house." The day, most people believe, or many commentators, because of the day is specified, this was either a feast day or a celebration of maybe the birth or a marriage between his siblings and someone else. It was a significant day. But what I want us to see is how it begins to introduce the trials. I want you to see how unexpected they come on Job. I don't think the parallel's intentional, but you remember when the floods came upon the earth in Genesis 6, and then Jesus refers to them in Matthew chapter 24. What were people doing? They were eating and drinking. They weren't thinking about it. That's kind of what's happening here. These are unexpected. But not only that, I want you to see this sets the stage for how far Job falls. I mean, they're there having a good time. They're celebrating. And yet, by the time we get to around verse 8 of chapter 2, he's sitting outside in the city dump. I mean, that's a pretty far distance that he fell. And so verse 13 sets up this contrast, I believe, that we're going to see in chapters 1 and 2. And so the trials follow the first set of trials, and they have somewhat of a pattern attached to it. We have human agents that Satan seems to use, and then he uses what I'm going to call natural agents. and they flip-flop back and forth. First, it's the Sabaeans. They come, it says, as we look there in verses 14 and 15, and they come and they take the oxen who were plowing. The oxen weren't playing, they were plowing. The oxen plowing and the donkeys who were feeding alongside of them, and also killed all the servants who were attending them, except for one who survived to come and tell the tale. Then, what happens next? Fire of God came down. It says, if you look in verse 16, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants who were serving them, all except one who remained alive to bear the tale. To back up just a little bit, the Sabaeans, we don't really know who they are. The best speculation is, or the most common, is these were descendants of Abraham and Keturah, and they lived kind of in northern Arabia or Yemen, but kind of a nomadic people. The fire of God, don't know. I mean, some people say it's lightning. Some people say it was like the fire and brimstone that fell on Sodom and Gomorrah. I have more of a hard time with that because this was a tool that Satan used and employed, and that seemed like something God used to execute judgment. But I don't know, so we don't know. But fire from God, and whatever it did, it was able to consume the livestock and the serpents. Then we flip back to another human agent, the Chaldeans. Now, we've run across that word, the Chaldeans, later on in the Babylonian Empire, right? That's how the Babylonians are referred to. Not the same group of people. Most people think these are desert nomads and who had kind of they often came in and struck and took the livestock. They came in and took the camels and again slew all the servants that were caring for the camels, all except one. And then finally we had a wind that came and struck the home where his children were residing, and in the aftermath they were destroyed. Now, there's some commonalities in these things. Everything is taken except for one servant who's left alive to bear the tale. And the reason I guess that's the way the story's told, but it also gives this credence to the way the story plays out. These aren't just natural calamities. I mean, there was this one who was spared to come and bear the tale. The second thing, if you look at verses 16 and 17 and 18, I think most of your translations I looked at all begin with the word while. Okay, while this was happening, then while this was happening. I know it's in most English translations. But you get this sense that, this was not like, okay, the Sabaeans came and Job had time to kind of recover from that blow and get his mind wrapped around the loss and, okay, here's how we can recover. This is our recovery plan going forward. No, the while kind of gives this a sense of rapidity or alacrity. These things fell like hammer blows, one after another. And that's the first set of trials that Satan used to afflict Job. Well, he took everything he had, or everything that he had here on this earth that was precious. What about the second one? So what did Satan do there? Let's look over in chapter 2. Let's read verses 4 through 7. Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now, touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to his face." So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. So Satan was given permission to attack Job physically. And the only limitation, God said, you cannot take his life. Everything else is fair game. And people have then kind of gone and started speculating. I mean, they tried to diagnose Job. You know, he's got elephantitis or some type of leprosy. And the funny thing about that, there may be a time and place for that. Realize this is not a natural disease that befalls him. And as you kind of just start getting glimpses of the condition that he goes through, I mean, he has this intense pain. He's got peeling and darkened skin. There's pus-filled and erupting boils or sores. He has some type of, emaciation. He's got fever, depression, weeping, sleeplessness, nightmares, difficulty breathing, failing vision, painful swollen sores all over his body. And I want you to understand, this lasted for months. I think that was one of the cool things as I was kind of reading through this to try to wrap my mind around that. I don't guess I thought about the time element involved in this. But in Job chapter, like a place like Job chapter 29, and just notice, if you would, what he says in verse 2 of Job 29. Oh, that I were as in the months gone by, as in the days when God watched over me. And the implication just from that one verse is Job reflecting back. He says, I wish I was like I was back then when months have gone by. So we look at this series of discourses and these events that follow, and we kind of read them as an encapsulated unit. But apparently there is a great period of time that passes that this condition exists in Job and seems to worsen as the time goes on. And so that's how Satan afflicted or tried Job. So, and here's where he finally ends up in Job chapter 2 and verse 8. And he said he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Chapter 1, verse 13, partying with his kids. Chapter 2, verse 8, outside with a potsherd. Does everybody know what's a potsherd? Yeah. I mean, it's a big fancy way to say just broken piece of pottery, okay? And apparently that was the only thing that he had to somehow tend to himself. And he found himself sitting among the ashes. Most people believe that idea of the ashes was, some people say dung heap, but it's more likely it was the city dump where people would take their garbage from the city outside the gates and burn it. And what that really meant is how far Job had fallen. In Job chapter 29 and verse 7, he said in the city gates, that was his position of honor. And here's where he's sitting now, ostracized and regarded as refuse. Wayne.
This is not necessarily a question for you, David. I read your question that you sent to us by email. This is for anyone. How does one answer a person who questions this and says, I understand that we get tests all the time, that we're tempted, today. But this seems to be people suffering, children, servants, that type of thing, simply because the Lord allowed the devil to test Job. How does one answer the fairness of that?
So what do you think? The fairness. So the thing is to go to answer that question, there's probably no answer that we have in our toolbox given to us by God that answers every nuance of that question. That's the first thing. We've got to know our limitations and can't just simply explaining away as it is not problematic or not hurtful. But the first thing that we want to know is first of all, God's sovereignty, His goodness, and ultimately how He dealt with that and the promise of how He's going to deal with that through Jesus Christ. Now, Does that answer every question? I don't think so. But it does point us in an answer that we can trust God despite those things that we struggle with. And that's even the answer here in the book of Job. There is no answer given in Job. And quite frankly, I mean, I don't know how you read Job, but when you get to the end of it, as far as I know, Job doesn't get an explanation, a full-fledged explanation of everything that happens to him or befalls him. And the fact is, it even says, God seems to say, you wouldn't even know the answer if I explained it to you to some degree. And so, that is a tough question, and I don't know that we have all the answers. The answers that we do have are good, and I think we can trust God despite the things that are unanswerable. Brother Paul.
We know the character of God is redemptive. And it was redemptive for Job. But this may be redemptive for us. The story is told for our sake, that we can get through difficult periods with the confidence that God will work this thing out redemptively.
Okay. So if you didn't hear Brother Paul, everybody, is we know the character of God is redemptive. And God recorded this and allowed these things to happen so that we can use this in our trials and our troubles as he tries to redeem us. Is that a fair summation? Brother White?
I guess the answer that I might give is, if we could ask Job today, from where he sits today, presumably in heaven with God, would he think it was unfair what he went through? I would think not, right? But he has the benefit of perspective. When we judge fairness, we're often thinking in a very narrow lens of what's right now. Even by the end of his life, he may have reflected back on that and thought, no, you know, even in this moment, in a way, he's reflecting on it and saying, shall we not accept, can we take good for bad, shall we not accept bad?
So,
With the perspective of thousands of years of eternity, changes that picture of fairness for us.
amen. Good point. Boyd, then.
I think this is exactly what Job questions in chapter 31. He says everything is just like, how could this be fair? He points out all the good that he's done in his life and his goodness. And you're struggling with the very same question. And then the line moves starts getting to the heart of the matter, and then God answers it. So I think you find the answer to that question in the chapters following chapter 3.
And ultimately, I think it revolves. I'm going to go to Wyatt's point, then Boyd's, and then we move forward. I think you can have perspective. And even Job, here in the midst of that, you alluded to it, even in the midst of his suffering, at least chapters 1 and 2, he could have a perspective that even in the midst of all this unfairness, he could still worship God based upon his knowledge of the goodness of God. And then I couple that with eternity. His perspective has changed. Part of the answer is, the answers as we kind of go through the book of Job is, again, goes back to the character of God. I don't know if there's a specific answer given in each and every situation, but it goes back to the character of God and ultimately his goodness. So let me ask this question. What was Satan's intention with these two trials? What did Satan hope to accomplish?
He is at war with God.
Okay.
And he wants to demonstrate to God that nobody will serve him just for the sake of his character.
Okay.
And he uses man. Job gets caught in it. But the war is with God, not with man. Men are just cannon fodder in his battle. And he's going to demonstrate with Job that the reason he's serving you
Okay. So Brother Paul says his desire, his war is with God. And he is attacking Job to expose the folly that man would serve God out of just a love for God and not what he would provide for them. And the war is with God, and Job just gets caught up in this epic struggle between Satan and Satan and God as he tries to prove his point. Here in chapters 1 and 2, specifically though, what Satan's intention with Job as stated is that he would curse God. That's what specifically is he wants to accomplish at this very point in Job chapter 1 and 2 is that he would curse God. You see it in verse 11 of chapter 1. He says, "But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to his face." Chapter 2, verse 5. "He will curse you to his face if you reach out and touch his bone and flesh." And Job was so concerned about that. Why did he offer sacrifices for his children? In verse 5. Is because, he said, they may have cursed God in their hearts. He knew that was something that was concerning. And Scripture does point at that idea of cursing God. We have an account in Leviticus chapter 24 of an Israelite who is married to an Egyptian, and their child gets in a struggle with someone else, and in the midst of that struggle, he curses God. And the people were told to take him outside the camp, and everyone was to touch him, and he was to die because he cursed God. Remember Naboth's vineyard? What was the false charge that was raised against Naboth? He cursed God, so he was worthy to be put to death. So maybe the question is what does it mean to curse God? What is Satan hoping that Job will do here? Openly renounce. A lot of places in Scripture, there's things attributed. It could be taking credit for what God does. It could be maligning God. It could be blaspheming God. But ultimately, as Boyd suggests, is to turn away from God, turn away from his clinging to God. We kind of get a picture of that in Job 21 in verses 14 and 15, where this description is given. It's people that say to God, "Depart from us. We do not even desire the knowledge of your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain if we entreat him?" That's the attitude that Satan hopes to engender in Job, it seems to me. And the point is even though that's Satan's desire, Job passes the test. In Job 1 and 22, and then at the end of chapter 2 and verse 10, through all of this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. But ultimately, as Brother Paul points out, that is what he wished for Job to do, but ultimately what Satan wanted to do is have God be cast down. And what Job did by overcoming was to vindicate God's trust in him. Meredith Klein in the Wycliffe Bible Dictionary said kind of this: "The satanic assault on the integrity of Job is thus ultimately an assault on the integrity of God. He was claiming that God had bribed the profane Job to act pious. And his idea is that if I strip all this away, there's no way Job would serve him. And because Job remained true, God was ultimately vindicated in his trust in Job." So that's what Satan wanted to occur. So, how did everybody react? Satan does all this. He attacks God. Job is vindicated. How does everybody react? How does Job react to these things? What's the first thing he does after the first set of trials? Isn't that kind of strange? You lost all your possessions, at least how you measure wealth. You've lost your children, and yet what we see And as we look in chapter 1, in verse 20, then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, he fell to the ground, and he worshiped. Stripped and hurting, but yet he worshiped. Job in this very picture, it seems to me, points to the idea that God was worth loving for who he is and not merely for what he gives. And he sees God even in his life in the midst of loss. Notice that he says in 21 and 22, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gives, and the Lord is taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Well, Satan's right in one way. Some people do serve the Lord because of what he does. They love him because of the things he gives them, the life they live. They do that. The real test comes is when things go bad. When things go bad, well, they still do. Well, Job did. But a lot of people don't.
Absolutely.
And Satan knows that too. And maybe he was taking to like, Job, yeah, you're doing all these things for me. But the odds were not low that things were taken away, that he would. Because that's what people do.
Absolutely. And I think that's what a tactic that he plays over and over again because it works. Somebody said it this way: Job's exclamation is the noblest expression to be found anywhere of a man's joyful acceptance of the will of God as his only good. A man may stand before God stripped of everything that life has given him and still lack nothing. And that's kind of a little bit to Chad's point a little bit earlier. Brother Paul?
Well, Satan was struggling. He thought it was getting when he took everything from him. He proposed a second. What his premise is, that if you take everything away from man, he'll be just like I am. He will curse you and defy.
You see a level of cynicism in Satan that he doubts that man would serve God without being bribed. And he would turn and act like Satan. What about Job's wife? She faced in many respects the same trials that Job did, but yet she failed. She wasn't aware of the limitations that God had placed on Satan's power or power over Job. And she just simply says, curse God and die. I want you to see in some ways that I think this is very reminiscent of Genesis chapter 3 in some ways. The narrative reminds us repeatedly of the temptation of Eden. Job's wife plays a role remarkably like that of Eve. Each woman succumbed to the tempter and became his instrument for the undoing of her husband. And I want you to just think about that as everything is stripped away from Job besides his relationship with God and his wife, who apparently was not harmed. The place that he should have been able to turn to draw some sense of comfort became potentially another source of stumbling for him. Curse God and die. And then we have basically Job's three friends, at the end of chapter 2, Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz. They come, and I just tell you, they come and they're shocked. They're shocked that such a good man is going through this. They're deeply wounded by everything he's going through, and they're probably even confused because they thought Job was blameless and upright, and yet he's suffering, apparently, because they understood all suffering related to sin. And they just come and they sit with him. In the end of chapter 2, that's probably the best that his three friends will look in the rest of the book. Okay, when they came and they kept their mouth shut, that was their highlight. After they opened their mouth, their troubles started coming up. So, Boyd.
I think we see, and we point out, is that the premise is that if you're successful and everything's going great, that God is pleased with you, and if you're suffering tragedy, he's not pleased with you. And that was their position, that's the friend's position. And Job begins to have somewhat that position as well, toward the end of his before
Yeah, that idea we looked at a couple of weeks ago of retribution as kind of the theology of the day. And it's a very common one. We see it in the New Testament as well. The only people doing good, God must be blessing. If you're doing evil, you must have some sin. And that's the absolute litmus test of your faith. So the bell's getting ready to ring. I'll still get to this one of these days, but I still want to talk about this scene in heaven, but anybody else, we'll stop there tonight. So thanks everybody for your comments, and we'll pick up there in chapter 3 next week. It's warmer down there.